The fluorescent lights of Naval Base San Diego's main cafeteria cast their usual harsh glow over rows of metal tables and plastic chairs. Steam rose from the serving lines where hundreds of sailors, Marines, and other military personnel grabbed their meals during the busy lunch rush. The constant buzz of conversation mixed with the clatter of trays and the occasional burst of laughter that echoed off the institutional walls. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez sat at his usual table near the corner window, his broad shoulders filling out his Navy working uniform as he methodically worked through his meal. At 32, Marcus had earned his place among the elite Navy SEALs through 12 years of distinguished service, including 4 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 to Iraq. His chest bore the ribbons and badges that told the story of a warrior who had seen combat, led men through impossible missions, and earned the respect of his peers through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication. The SEAL community was small and tight-knit, and Marcus knew most of the operators on the West Coast by name and reputation. He carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from knowing he belonged to one of the most elite fighting forces in the world. When people saw his trident pin, they knew they were looking at someone who had endured months of the most brutal training the military had to offer and emerged victorious. Marcus glanced around the crowded cafeteria, noting the familiar faces of his teammates scattered throughout the room. Lieutenant Jake Morrison sat 3 tables over, still nursing a shoulder injury from their last training exercise. Across the room, Petty Officer First Class David Kim was engaged in an animated conversation with some Air Force personnel, probably telling stories about their recent joint operation in the Pacific. The cafeteria served as neutral ground where all branches of the military came together, creating an interesting social dynamic. Marines sat next to sailors, Air Force personnel shared tables with Army soldiers, and officers mingled freely with enlisted personnel in a way that would have been impossible in more formal military settings. It was one of the few places on base where rank seemed to matter less than the shared experience of serving your country. As Marcus finished his sandwich, he noticed a woman in navy dress blues sitting alone at a nearby table. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and an Asian heritage that suggested she might be Chinese or Korean American. What caught his attention was not her appearance, but rather the unfamiliar rank insignia on her collar and the fact that she was sitting by herself while reading what appeared to be an official military document. The woman carried herself with a quiet dignity that Marcus had learned to recognize in fellow military personnel, but something about her seemed different. She had the posture of someone accustomed to authority, yet there was a gentleness in her demeanor that seemed almost out of place in the harsh environment of military life. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her shoes polished to mirror brightness, and every detail of her appearance spoke to someone who took pride in military standards. Marcus found himself studying her rank insignia more closely. The silver oak leaves on her collar indicated she was a lieutenant commander, which meant she outranked him significantly. This surprised him, not because women couldn't achieve high rank in the Navy, but because she looked younger than most lieutenant commanders he had encountered. In the SEAL community, rank often took a back seat to operational experience and proven combat effectiveness, and Marcus had developed certain assumptions about what senior officers looked like and how they carried themselves. The woman seemed completely absorbed in her reading, occasionally making notes in the margins of her document with a precise, careful handwriting that spoke to attention to detail. She ate her salad with the same methodical approach, never rushing, never appearing to be in a hurry despite the busy atmosphere surrounding her. There was something almost meditative about her presence that stood in stark contrast to the usual energy of the military cafeteria. Marcus finished his meal, but found himself reluctant to leave. Something about the woman intrigued him, and he began to wonder what her story might be. In his experience, Navy officers who achieved the rank of lieutenant commander usually had extensive sea time or specialized technical expertise that had earned them rapid promotion. But this woman seemed different somehow, carrying herself with a quiet authority that suggested experiences beyond the typical naval career path. The cafeteria around them continued its usual rhythm of military life. New personnel rotated through the serving lines, conversations rose, and fell in volume, and the constant background noise of a busy military installation provided a soundtrack to the daily routine that had become second nature to everyone present. Yet somehow, this woman seemed to exist in her own peaceful bubble, undisturbed by the chaos around her. As Marcus watched, a group of young sailors approached the woman's table. They appeared to be fresh out of basic training, their uniforms still showing the crisp creases of new-issue clothing, and their movements carrying the nervous energy of people still learning to navigate military culture. One of them, a seaman recruit who couldn't have been older than 19, stepped forward with the kind of misplaced confidence that often came from not yet understanding the full complexity of military hierarchy. The young sailor cleared his throat and addressed the woman with a casual familiarity that immediately caught Marcus's attention. Military protocol dictated specific ways of addressing officers, particularly those of significantly higher rank, and this kid seemed completely unaware of the proper procedures. Marcus found himself leaning forward slightly, curious to see how this interaction would unfold. The lieutenant commander looked up from her document with patient eyes and a slight smile that suggested she was accustomed to such interruptions. She set down her pen with deliberate care and gave the young sailor her full attention, displaying the kind of grace under pressure that Marcus had learned to associate with true leadership. Her response would either educate the young man about proper military courtesy or potentially escalate into an uncomfortable situation that would require intervention. Marcus realized he was witnessing one of those moments that often define military culture. How senior personnel dealt with junior sailors who hadn't yet learned proper protocol could either build confidence and understanding or create fear and resentment that lasted for years. This lieutenant commander's response would say volumes about her character and leadership philosophy. The tension in the air was subtle but palpable. Other personnel at nearby tables had begun to notice the interaction, though most continued eating while keeping one eye on the developing situation. In the military, everyone understood that such moments could quickly escalate or just as easily dissolve into teachable moments that benefited everyone involved. Marcus found himself hoping this woman would handle the situation with wisdom and patience. Too often, he had seen senior personnel use their rank as a weapon rather than a tool for teaching and mentoring. The fact that she had already shown such grace in her initial response suggested she might be one of the good ones, the kind of leader who understood that true authority came from respect rather than fear. The young sailor stood waiting for her response, clearly unaware that he was about to receive an education in more than just military protocol. Around them, the cafeteria continued its normal routine, but Marcus sensed that something significant was about to happen, something that would change how everyone present understood the true nature of service and sacrifice. The young seaman recruit shifted nervously from foot to foot as he prepared to speak. His name tag read Thompson, and despite his obvious inexperience, there was something earnest about his approach that suggested good intentions behind what was clearly going to be a breach of military protocol. His friends hung back slightly, recognizing that their companion was venturing into potentially dangerous territory, but unwilling to abandon him to face the consequences alone. "Excuse me, ma'am," Thompson began, his voice carrying the uncertain tone of someone who wasn't quite sure how to phrase his question. "I was wondering if you could help settle a debate my buddies and I have been having. We've been trying to figure out the rank structure, and we're confused about your insignia." Lieutenant Commander Sarachin set down her pen completely and turned her full attention to the young sailor. Her expression remained patient and kind, though Marcus noticed a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was already anticipating where this conversation might lead. She had clearly dealt with similar situations before and understood the delicate balance required to educate without humiliating. "Of course," she replied, her voice carrying a warm professionalism that immediately put the young sailor at ease. "What specifically would you like to know about rank structure? It can be confusing when you're first starting out." Thompson's confidence seemed to grow with her encouraging response, and he gestured toward her collar insignia. "Well, we know this lieutenant commander rank, but we were wondering how someone gets promoted so quickly in the Navy. I mean, you look pretty young to be such a high-ranking officer, and we figured maybe there's some kind of fast-track program we don't know about. The question itself wasn't inherently disrespectful, but Marcus could hear the underlying assumptions embedded in the young man's words. Thompson was essentially questioning whether Sarah had earned her rank through the traditional channels of hard work and dedication, or whether she might have benefited from some kind of preferential treatment. It was the kind of innocent ignorance that could easily be corrected with proper guidance, but it also revealed the deeper cultural assumptions that still existed within military ranks. Sarah's smile never wavered, but Marcus noticed her posture straighten slightly, a subtle shift that suggested she was transitioning into teaching mode. She had clearly encountered this type of question before and had developed strategies for addressing the underlying misconceptions without making the questioner feel foolish or attacked. "That's an excellent question," Sarah replied, her tone remaining warm and educational. Promotion in the Navy is based on a combination of factors, including time in service, performance evaluations, specialized training, and the needs of the service. Every path to rank is different, and there are many ways to serve your country with distinction. Thompson nodded eagerly, apparently satisfied with this general explanation, but one of his friends stepped forward with a more pointed question. Petty Officer Third Class Rodriguez, a young man who had been in the service slightly longer than Thompson, seemed emboldened by their officer's patient responses and decided to probe deeper into what he clearly saw as an opportunity to understand military culture better. "But ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what's your specialty? I mean, most lieutenant commanders I've met have been in the Navy for 15 or 20 years, and they usually have pretty impressive sea time or technical backgrounds. Are you in intelligence or medical or something like that?" This question crossed a line from innocent curiosity into potentially inappropriate territory. Rodriguez was essentially demanding that a senior officer justify her rank and qualifications to a group of junior enlisted personnel, a breach of military courtesy that would normally result in swift correction. Marcus found himself tensing, waiting to see how Sarah would handle this escalation while maintaining her educational approach. Sarah paused for a moment, her eyes moving thoughtfully across the faces of the young sailors gathered around her table. Marcus could see her carefully considering her response, weighing the benefits of using this as a teaching moment against the potential need to assert her authority and put these sailors back in their proper place within the military hierarchy. "I appreciate your curiosity about naval careers," she said finally, her voice still patient, but carrying a subtle undertone that suggested the conversation was approaching its limits. "There are many different paths to leadership in the military, and each officer's journey is unique. What's most important is that we all serve our country to the best of our abilities, regardless of our specific roles or backgrounds." But Rodriguez pressed further, apparently misreading Sarah's diplomatic response as encouragement to continue his line of questioning. His next words carried a tone that Marcus recognized as potentially dangerous, the kind of casual disrespect that could quickly escalate into a serious breach of military discipline. "I guess what we're really wondering is whether you're one of those officers who came up through the academy, or if you're more of a desk jockey who got promoted because of paperwork and politics. No offense, ma'am, but you don't really look like you've seen much action, and we're trying to figure out who we should actually be taking advice from around here." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt his own temper flare at the casual disrespect being shown to a senior officer. This was no longer innocent curiosity about military rank structure. This had become a direct questioning of Sarah's credibility and qualifications based on assumptions about her appearance and gender. The young sailor had essentially accused her of being unworthy of her rank and unqualified to offer guidance to junior personnel. Marcus noticed that conversations at nearby tables had begun to quiet as other military personnel picked up on the tension developing in their corner of the cafeteria. Several senior enlisted personnel had turned their attention toward the interaction, their expressions suggesting they were preparing to intervene if the situation continued to deteriorate. The easygoing atmosphere of the lunch crowd was giving way to something more serious and potentially volatile. Sarah's response would be crucial not just for these young sailors, but for everyone watching. How she handled this moment of direct disrespect would either reinforce the military's commitment to mutual respect and proper protocol, or it could escalate into exactly the kind of confrontation that undermined unit cohesion and military discipline. Marcus found himself studying Sarah's face intently, watching for signs of anger or frustration that might signal how she planned to respond. But what he saw instead surprised him. Rather than anger or indignation, Sarah's expression showed something that looked almost like compassion, as if she understood something about this situation that the rest of them were missing. The cafeteria around them continued its normal rhythm, but Marcus could sense that the energy had shifted. People were watching now, waiting to see how this drama would unfold. Some seemed eager for confrontation, others appeared concerned about the potential for escalation, and a few looked like they wanted to intervene, but weren't sure whether their involvement would help or make things worse. Rodriguez stood waiting for her response, apparently unaware that he had just crossed a line that could potentially result in formal disciplinary action. His friends looked less confident now, beginning to recognize that their companion might have pushed too far and that they could all face consequences for their involvement in what had started as innocent curiosity but had evolved into something much more serious. Sarah took a slow breath, her hands folded calmly in her lap as she prepared to respond to this direct challenge to her authority and qualifications. Marcus found himself leaning forward slightly, genuinely curious to see how this remarkable woman would handle a situation that had clearly moved beyond the bounds of normal military courtesy and into territory that demanded a more decisive response. Sarah Chun remained perfectly still for several heartbeats, her dark eyes moving slowly across the faces of the young sailors gathered around her table. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, but there was nothing threatening or intimidating in her demeanor. Instead, she seemed to be taking the measure of each person present, evaluating not just their words but their character and potential for growth. Marcus watched her with growing fascination. In his experience, most senior officers faced with such direct disrespect would have immediately asserted their authority, either through a sharp reprimand or by involving security personnel. The fact that Sarah was taking time to consider her response suggested either remarkable patience or a strategy that went beyond simple disciplinary action. "You know," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying the same warm tone she had maintained throughout the conversation, "you raise an interesting point about qualifications and experience. It's something every military member should think about carefully." She gestured toward the empty chairs at her table, an invitation that surprised everyone present. "Would you mind sitting down for a moment? I think this conversation deserves more than a quick answer, and standing up while we talk seems unnecessarily formal." Rodriguez looked uncertain, glancing at his friends for guidance. This was not the response he had expected, and the calm invitation threw him off balance. Thompson stepped forward first, apparently deciding that accepting the offer was better than continuing to stand awkwardly while the entire cafeteria watched their interaction. As the young sailors settled into chairs around her table, Sarah pushed her official documents to one side and gave them her complete attention. Marcus noticed that her movements remained deliberate and controlled, showing no signs of the anger or frustration that most people would feel when faced with such disrespectful questioning. "Before I answer your question about my qualifications," Sarah said, looking directly at Rodriguez, "I'd like to ask you something. What do you think makes someone qualified to lead in the military? Is it time in service? Combat experience? Technical expertise? Something else entirely?" The question caught Rodriguez off guard. He had clearly expected either an angry confrontation or a detailed justification of Sarah's career path. Instead, she was asking him to think critically about leadership and qualifications in a way that made him an active participant in the conversation rather than simply a target for correction. "Well," Rodriguez began hesitantly, "I guess combat experience is pretty important. I mean, how can you lead people into dangerous situations if you haven't been there yourself? And time in service matters because it shows you understand how the military works and have earned your rank through experience." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if she were genuinely considering his perspective rather than simply waiting for him to finish so she could correct him. "Those are both valid points. Combat experience and understanding military culture are certainly valuable qualifications. What about education and specialized training? Do you think those contribute to leadership effectiveness?" Thompson joined the conversation, seeming more confident now that the discussion had taken on an educational tone rather than a confrontational one. I suppose technical knowledge is important too, especially for officers who are responsible for complex systems or strategic planning. But at the end of the day, people want to follow someone they respect, someone who's proven themselves under pressure. Excellent observation, Sarah replied, and Marcus could tell her approval was genuine rather than patronizing. Respect is indeed crucial for effective leadership. But here's what I've learned over the years. Respect comes in many different forms, and people prove themselves in many different ways. Sometimes the most important qualifications aren't the ones that show up on your uniform. She paused, looking around the table at each of the young sailors. You asked about my background and qualifications, and I think you deserve an honest answer. But before I share that information, I want you to understand something important about military service. Marcus found himself leaning closer, genuinely curious about where Sarah was taking this conversation. Her approach was unlike anything he had witnessed in similar situations, and he was beginning to suspect that these young sailors were about to receive an education that went far beyond simple military protocol. Every person in this cafeteria, Sarah continued, gesturing around the room, has a story. Every uniform represents sacrifices, challenges overcome, and service to something greater than personal ambition. Some of those stories involve combat deployments, some involve years at sea, some involve technical innovations that keep our forces safe and effective. All of those stories matter. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair, apparently beginning to recognize that his assumptions about Sarah's qualifications might have been premature. Ma'am, I didn't mean to suggest that non-combat roles aren't important. I just thought that for leadership positions, especially high-ranking ones, you thought that visible, traditionally masculine forms of service were more important than other contributions, Sarah said gently, cutting him off without malice. It's an understandable assumption, and one that many people make. But let me ask you this. Would you rather follow someone in a battle because they had impressive combat ribbons, or because you knew they had the knowledge, judgment, and commitment to bring you home safely? The question hung in the air, forcing the young sailors to confront the complexity of military leadership in a way they had apparently never considered. Marcus realized that Sarah was systematically dismantling their preconceptions while simultaneously teaching them valuable lessons about respect, leadership, and the diverse ways people could serve their country with distinction. Now, Sarah said, her voice taking on a more serious tone while maintaining its warmth, you asked about my qualifications and background. I believe in transparency, especially when it comes to helping junior personnel understand career paths and leadership development. She folded her hands on the table, her posture indicating that she was about to share something significant. I graduated from a Naval Academy 12 years ago, where I studied aerospace engineering and spent my free time volunteering with wounded veterans at Walter Reed Medical Center. After graduation, I completed flight school and became a naval aviator, flying F/A-18 Super Hornets. This revelation caused Thompson to sit up straighter in his chair, his eyes widening with surprise. Rodriguez looked equally stunned, apparently beginning to realize that his assumptions about Sarah's background had been completely wrong. I deployed 3 times to the Middle East, Sarah continued, her tone remaining matter-of-fact despite the significance of what she was sharing. I flew 74 combat missions over Afghanistan and Iraq, providing close air support for ground forces and conducting strategic strikes against high-value targets. Marcus felt his own assumptions being challenged as Sarah spoke. Naval aviators, especially those who had flown combat missions in F/-18S, represented some of the most elite and highly trained personnel in the military. The training required to become a carrier-qualified fighter pilot was arguably as demanding as anything the military had to offer, and combat flying required split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. 2 years ago, Sarah said, her voice becoming quieter, I was shot down during a mission over Syria. I spent 6 days evading capture before being rescued by a special operations team. During that time, I sustained injuries that ended my flying career, but taught me lessons about survival, resilience, and the true meaning of service that no training program could have provided. The table fell into complete silence as the implications of Sarah's words sank in. Rodriguez looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair, while Thompson stared at her with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. Around the cafeteria, conversations had stopped as people picked up on the serious turn the discussion had taken. Sarah continued speaking, but her focus seemed to shift beyond the immediate group to encompass everyone within earshot. I now work in strategic planning at the Pentagon, helping design training programs and operational protocols that save lives and improve mission effectiveness. My current role isn't as visible as flying combat missions, but it directly impacts thousands of service members every day. Marcus realized that the entire cafeteria had become Sarah's classroom, and everyone present was receiving an education in humility, respect, and the true nature of military service. This was not just a correction of inappropriate behavior. It was a masterclass in leadership and grace under pressure. The weight of Sarah's revelation settled over the cafeteria like a blanket of hushed respect. Rodriguez sat frozen in his chair, his face flushed with embarrassment and shame as the full magnitude of his misjudgment became clear. Thompson looked equally mortified, while their friends who had remained standing took unconscious steps backward, as if distance might somehow diminish their association with the disrespectful questioning that had preceded Sarah's explanation. Marcus felt his own chest tighten as he processed what he had just heard. As a SEAL, he understood the extraordinary demands of military aviation, particularly carrier operations and combat flying. The training required to become a naval aviator was legendary in its difficulty, with washout rates that rivaled special operations selection courses. To not only complete that training, but to fly dozens of combat missions and survive being shot down behind enemy lines represented a level of skill, courage, and dedication that commanded absolute respect. Sarah allowed the silence to stretch for several moments, giving everyone present time to fully absorb the significance of her story. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same gentle tone she had maintained throughout the conversation, showing no trace of vindictiveness or desire to humiliate the young sailors who had questioned her qualifications. "The reason I'm sharing this with you," Sarah said, looking directly at Rodriguez, "isn't to make you feel bad about your assumptions. We all make judgments based on limited information, and learning to recognize and correct those biases is part of growing as both a service member and a person." She turned her attention to Thompson, including him in her explanation. "What I want you to understand is that military service comes in many forms, and each person's contribution matters regardless of how visible or traditionally impressive it might appear to others. The petty officer who maintains our computer systems might not have combat ribbons, but their work keeps our communications secure and our operations effective." Sarah gestured toward the broader cafeteria, where dozens of military personnel continued their meals while discreetly listening to her words. The logistics specialists who ensure supplies reach forward operating bases might never see direct combat, but without their expertise, combat operations would be impossible. The intelligence analyst who spends years studying enemy patterns and capabilities saves countless lives through their careful work, even though their contributions rarely receive public recognition. Marcus found himself nodding in agreement, thinking about the many support personnel who made SEAL operations possible. Behind every successful mission were dozens of people whose names never appeared in official reports, but whose contributions were absolutely essential to mission success. He began to realize that his own assumptions about military value and leadership effectiveness might need some examination. "The point," Sarah continued, "isn't that combat experience doesn't matter, or that all forms of service are exactly equivalent. Different roles require different skills and involve different levels of risk and responsibility. The point is that we should never assume we understand someone's qualifications or contributions based solely on their appearance or a limited perspective on their role." Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, I apologize. I had no right to question your qualifications, and I'm ashamed of the assumptions I made. You've served our country with honor and distinction, and I'm sorry for being so disrespectful." Sarah's response surprised everyone present. Instead of accepting the apology with stern dignity or using the moment to further emphasize the importance of military courtesy. She reached across the table and gently placed her hand on Rodriguez's arm in a gesture of understanding and forgiveness. "Thank you for that apology," she said, "but I want you to know that I'm not angry with you. You asked honest questions based on your current understanding of military culture, and those questions gave us an opportunity to have an important conversation about respect, assumptions, and the diverse ways people serve their country." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each of the young sailors. "What I hope you'll take away from this conversation isn't just that you should be more careful about questioning senior officers, though military courtesy is certainly important. What I hope you'll remember is that every person you meet has a story you don't know, experiences you haven't shared, and contributions you might not immediately recognize." Thompson spoke up, his voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than the casual skepticism that had characterized the earlier questions. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what was it like being shot down? How did you survive for 6 days on your own?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "It was terrifying and lonely and physically painful in ways I had never experienced. But it was also educational. When you're reduced to basic survival, you discover things about yourself and about what really matters that you might never learn in normal circumstances." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep moving forward despite being afraid. I learned that survival depends not just on physical skills, but on mental resilience and the ability to maintain hope even when everything seems hopeless. And I learned that the support and dedication of fellow service members can literally mean the difference between life and death." Marcus found himself hanging on her every word, recognizing truths that resonated with his own combat experiences. The way Sarah described survival and resilience spoke to someone who had genuinely faced life and death situations and emerged with hard-won wisdom rather than simple bragging rights. "The special operations team that rescued me," Sarah continued, "risked their lives to bring me home. They didn't know me personally, and my rescue wasn't going to advance their careers or earn them recognition. They did it because I was a fellow service member, and that was enough. That's what military service really means: the commitment to something larger than yourself, and the willingness to sacrifice for people you might never meet." The conversation had drawn the attention of personnel throughout the cafeteria, though most continued eating while listening respectfully to Sarah's words. Marcus noticed several senior enlisted personnel nodding in approval at her message, while younger service members seemed to be absorbing lessons about military culture and values that went far beyond what they would learn in any formal training program. "Now," Sarah said, her tone becoming more businesslike while retaining its warmth, "I think we've covered the important points about qualifications and military service. Do you have any other questions about rank structure or career development that I can help you with?" The young sailors exchanged glances, apparently trying to decide whether to continue the conversation or make a graceful exit. Finally, Thompson spoke up with a question that showed genuine interest in learning rather than challenging authority. "Ma'am, for someone just starting their Navy career, what advice would you give about developing leadership skills and earning the respect of peers and superiors?" Sarah smiled, clearly pleased by the shift toward constructive dialogue. "That's an excellent question, and one that shows you're thinking seriously about your military future. Leadership development is a lifelong process, and it starts with self-awareness and a commitment to continuous improvement." As she began to share practical advice about military leadership, Marcus found himself studying this remarkable woman with new eyes. Everything about her demeanor and approach to this difficult situation demonstrated the kind of leadership qualities he had spent his career trying to develop. She had transformed a potentially damaging confrontation into a teaching moment that would benefit not just the immediate participants, but everyone who witnessed the interaction. As Sarah continued sharing leadership advice with the young sailors, Marcus found himself reflecting on his own assumptions and biases. The conversation he had witnessed challenged fundamental beliefs he held about military effectiveness, leadership qualifications, and the relative value of different types of service. Here was a woman who had achieved everything he respected in military service: elite training, combat experience, survival under extreme conditions, and demonstrated leadership under pressure. Yet his initial reaction had been to question her presence and wonder about her background based solely on her appearance and gender. The realization was uncomfortable but necessary. Marcus began to understand that his years in the special operations community, while providing valuable experience and skills, had also created blind spots in his understanding of military service and leadership. The exclusive nature of SEAL teams, while essential for operational effectiveness, had perhaps limited his appreciation for the diverse ways people could serve their country with distinction. Sarah's advice to the young sailors was practical and insightful, covering everything from the importance of technical competence to the value of mentoring junior personnel. She spoke about leadership as a responsibility rather than a privilege, emphasizing the obligation that came with rank and authority to develop and protect those under your command. "Remember," Sarah said, addressing the group, but speaking loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "leadership isn't about proving you're the toughest or most impressive person in the room. It's about creating conditions where others can succeed and making decisions that serve the mission and protect your people, even when those decisions are difficult or unpopular." Rodriguez had been listening intently, occasionally asking follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely trying to learn from his earlier mistake. "Ma'am, how do you handle situations where people question your authority or qualifications? Do you ever get angry or frustrated when people make assumptions about you?" Sarah considered the question carefully, glancing briefly in Marcus's direction as if she had been aware of his attention throughout the conversation. "Of course I get frustrated sometimes," she replied honestly. "Everyone does when they feel misunderstood or unfairly judged. But I've learned that how you respond to those situations says more about your character than the initial assumptions people make about you." She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. "When someone questions my qualifications or makes assumptions based on my appearance, I have a choice. I can respond with anger and use my rank to shut down the conversation, or I can see it as an opportunity to educate and perhaps change someone's perspective. Both responses might be justified, but only one has the potential to create positive change." Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you're saying it's better to try to teach people rather than just punish them for being ignorant?" "I'm saying that punishment alone rarely changes hearts and minds," Sarah replied. "People learn and grow when they're given information and treated with respect, even when they haven't initially shown that same respect to others. That doesn't mean accepting disrespectful behavior, but it does mean looking for ways to turn negative situations into positive learning experiences." Marcus felt a profound shift in his own understanding as he listened to Sarah's words. Her approach to leadership represented something he had rarely seen in the military: the combination of absolute competence with genuine humility, strength with compassion, authority with accessibility. She had demonstrated that true confidence didn't require constantly proving superiority over others, but rather came from secure knowledge of one's own capabilities and value. As the conversation began to wind down, other military personnel started approaching Sarah's table. Word had spread throughout the cafeteria about the exchange that had taken place, and several senior enlisted personnel wanted to express their appreciation for how she had handled the situation. A Master Chief Petty Officer stopped by to shake her hand, while a Marine Gunnery Sergeant nodded respectfully as he passed. Marcus realized that Sarah had accomplished something remarkable in the space of a single lunch conversation. She had not only corrected inappropriate behavior and educated young sailors about military courtesy, but she had also demonstrated leadership principles that would influence everyone who witnessed the interaction. The story would undoubtedly spread throughout the base, becoming one of those legendary examples that people referenced when discussing effective leadership and grace under pressure. The young sailors began to gather their belongings, clearly understanding that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Each of them thanked Sarah individually, with Rodriguez offering a particularly heartfelt apology that she accepted with the same grace she had shown throughout the entire interaction. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said as he prepared to leave, "I want you to know that I'll never forget this conversation. You could have destroyed me, for the way I questioned your qualifications, but instead you taught me something important about respect and service. I hope someday I can be the kind of leader you are." Sarah's smile was warm and genuine. "I have every confidence that you will be," she replied. "You asked honest questions and listened to the answers with an open mind. That's how all great leaders start their journey." As the young sailors departed, Marcus found himself standing and approaching Sarah's table. He had watched the entire interaction unfold and felt compelled to express his own appreciation for her handling of a difficult situation. But more than that, he wanted to acknowledge his own learning experience and perhaps apologize for the assumptions he had made. "Excuse me, Lieutenant Commander," Marcus said, using her proper rank and title. "I'm Chief Rodriguez with the SEAL teams. I wanted to thank you for the example you just set. That was some of the finest leadership I've ever witnessed." Sarah looked up at him with the same patient attention she had given the young sailors, though Marcus detected a hint of curiosity in her expression. "Thank you, Chief. I appreciate that. Are you stationed here at Coronado?" "Yes, ma'am. Been here for about 3 years now." Marcus hesitated, then decided to be honest about his own experience during the conversation. "I have to admit, when I first noticed you sitting here, I made some assumptions about your background that were completely wrong. Watching how you handled those sailors taught me as much about leadership as it taught them." Sarah's expression showed understanding rather than surprise. "We all make assumptions based on limited information, Chief. What matters is being willing to recognize when those assumptions are wrong and learning from the experience." Marcus nodded, feeling a deep respect for this remarkable officer. "Your story about being shot down and surviving behind enemy lines, that's the kind of courage and resilience we try to develop in special operations. You've proven yourself in ways that command absolute respect." "I appreciate that," Sarah replied, "but I want you to know that I have equal respect for what you and your teammates do. Special operations requires a unique combination of skills and dedication that serves our country in crucial ways. We're all part of the same team, just playing different positions." The mutual respect in their exchange felt genuine and meaningful. Marcus realized that this brief encounter had fundamentally changed his understanding of military leadership and the diverse ways people could serve with distinction. Sarah's example would influence how he approached his own leadership responsibilities and how he evaluated the contributions of fellow service members. As Marcus prepared to leave, Sarah spoke once more. "Chief, if you don't mind me saying so, the way you approach this conversation shows the kind of humility and openness to learning that makes for exceptional leadership. Your SEAL teams are fortunate to have someone like you." The compliment meant more to Marcus than any medal or commendation he had ever received, coming as it did from someone who had demonstrated such extraordinary grace under pressure. As he walked away from her table, Marcus carried with him lessons about leadership, respect, and military service that would influence his actions for years to come. The cafeteria gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but the impact of the conversation would ripple outward through the base community for weeks and months to come. Personnel would reference Sarah's example when discussing effective leadership, and the story would become part of the unofficial curriculum that shaped military culture and values. For Marcus, the encounter had been transformative in ways he was still processing. He had witnessed leadership that transcended rank and position, demonstrating instead the power of competence combined with humility, strength paired with compassion. It was a standard he would strive to meet in his own military service, and a reminder that true leadership came not from proving superiority over others, but from lifting others up and creating opportunities for growth and understanding. The lesson would stay with him forever. Never assume you know someone's story, never underestimate someone based on appearance, and always remain open to learning from unexpected teachers. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the quietest voices, and the strongest leaders are those who choose education over intimidation, understanding over judgment, and grace over ego.